Okay, Bob, describe your area of expertise in geology.
As a geologist, I have worked for the survey most of my professional life, really all of it since grad school. And my work has always involved volcanoes in one way or another, sometimes explicitly working directly on volcanoes, volcanology, or the geology of volcanoes. Sometimes working on tectonic problems that involve volcanic rocks, too. So I've been very interested in how volcanoes and magmatism are related to tectonics. So these are the two areas that I've spent most of my career working on.
Okay, and so where were you educated and what was your degree? And
I graduated both as an undergraduate, my bachelor's degree and my PhD were both from Stanford. I graduated in 1956, got my PhD in 1961 in geology, not in volcano studies, however. I was working in metamorphic petrology and structural geology at that time.
And how was it that you began working in Yellowstone?
I was one of a group of people who started working in Yellowstone in 1965. And the impetus for this was that Yellowstone had really not had a comprehensive geologic study since the late 19th century. Surprisingly enough, there had been individual specific topical studies, but there hadn't really been an overall comprehensive study of Yellowstone's geology in the modern era. So a group of us were tapped to undertake a new geologic map of Yellowstone. We were divided into 5 teams, and rather than just each one mapping his own area, which is often the way this sort of thing might have been done in a joint project like that, each person with a separate quadrangle, we actually worked in topical areas within the overall framework of Yellowstone geology. And so I was asked to organize a study of the young volcanic geology of Yellowstone. So there was a group of people doing the early geology, the pre-tertiary geology in the northern part of the park, a different group of people working in the southern part of the park on the same kind of thing. Another group working on the early tertiary volcanic rocks, which is a completely different problem. Then I and some colleagues worked on the quaternary volcanics, the young volcanics. And then there was yet another group of people studying the glaciation and related superficial geology. In addition to that, there were some other topical studies that went on simultaneously, including the geothermal studies that included drilling, isotopic studies, isotopic geochemistry, which was usually coordinated with the geologic studies that we were undertaking at that time. It came about because their funding became available to do this through a cooperative program involving the USGS, NASA, and the Park Service. Most of the money actually came from NASA. And their interest in it was they were at that time just developing a lot of the remote sensing instruments, which ultimately went into satellites and also into interplanetary probes. But they needed test areas where the geology was well known, where they could calibrate this instrumentation. So most of this was done with some of these instruments flying in aircraft. And then Yellowstone was one of several of these so-called ground truth areas, and that was the reason we got started on it at the time we did.
Describe how you felt the first time you saw LiDAR of Yellowstone.
Well, I mean, LiDAR is such a marvelous new technology. When you see the imagery, it's just different from any other kind of imagery we have. We had radar imagery and of course lots of different forms of aerial photography. But this LiDAR imagery shows details of the ground surface that you simply can't see. Sometimes you can't even see in the field because the features themselves are bigger than what you're actually seeing right in front of you, and other things like trees are in the way. So when you actually see it that way, it's really quite a, particularly when you are first seeing it, as you suggest, it's quite a spectacular thing.
How many years did you work in Yellowstone?
working there?
Well, I worked in Yellowstone intensively for a short time in the fall of 1965, but then every summer for about 3 months during the summer months from 1966 through 1971. So that was really when the bulk of the geologic mapping was done. And it was in Yellowstone and in some of the adjacent areas outside the park, because the geology didn't magically stop at the straight line park boundaries. So it included work down to Jackson Hole and over into the eastern part of the Snake River Plain as well. Then after that, after doing other things and then interspersed with other USGS assignments of one sort and another, I continued to work in Yellowstone for the next 25 years. But usually then it was in shorter increments in the field, a lot more involved in looking at the chemistry of the rocks and thin sections and looking at, again, at specific topical things, more collaboration with other geologists on the geochemistry and so forth.
What role did collaboration play in your work?
It was very essential. The interaction among the people working both in the field and then with our other colleagues who were doing lab type studies. The whole project really came to fruition because of this very intensive collaboration and the focus of a number of groups at the same time working on the same overall problem of Yellowstone's geology.
Were there epiphanies as the geologic story of Yellowstone began to unfold?
There were some epiphanies, so to speak, in terms of what we learned as we were going through this, particularly during this initial period, this 6 years of intensive field studies. I was very fortunate in that my particular area of study, the young volcanic rocks, there had been a fairly recent study, a PhD study by Joe Boyd, who became a geophysicist at the Carnegie Institution Geophysical Laboratory. But his PhD thesis had been to study some of these same rocks that I ended up studying with some of my colleagues. And he had done a wonderful job. I mean, considering that this was a thesis project and starting from scratch in an area that had really not been looked at all, he studied some of these young volcanic rocks and he really came to some of the big conclusions. That is to say, he recognized that the predominant rhyolitic rocks particularly around the margins of the park and the outer parts of the park were pyroclastic rocks instead of lava flows. And this was a very important thing, and he was the first person who really recognized that in a big way. In addition, he recognized that there must be some kind of, he called it a volcano-tectonic depression, that is to say a structural depression in the central part of the park somehow related to the eruption of these pyroclastics. He didn't have the full picture, what we now recognize as the Yellowstone caldera. But there were still many things that he was not able to recognize in that study. And one of our first big, in fact, really something we found in the first day we were in the field, my colleague Dick Blank and I went out to look at a particular locality that Boyd had described quite carefully, and he had interpreted as a vent for some of these pyroclastic rocks, these welded tuffs. It didn't sound right to us from his description, but it sounded like an important locality. So we went there, and on the very first day we recognized that rather than being a vent for the Yellowstone tuff, as he called it, it was two different ash flow tuff units, different in age, and one had been eroded and the other one had filled in some paleotopography that had been formed in that older unit. So from the very first day we got there, we realized we were dealing with more than one major pyroclastic eruption. It turns out that there were 3 of these major pyroclastic eruptions, separated in time by 700 to 800,000 years or so.
Okay, Bob, so tell me, what tools did you use in the field?
Describe
Well, yes, the tools I used in the work that I was doing, really was basic geologic mapping. The focus of the study was the volcanic geology, but the tool was really geologic mapping. So we used topographic maps, aerial photographs, Brunton compasses to measure various structural elements, rock hammers to collect samples, which of course were very important to us, which would later be either age determinations would be done on them or chemical analyses done on them, thin sections cut. And so collecting samples, putting lines on the maps, working primarily from air photographs originally, and then of course during the non-field times, a lot of it involved the use of various ways of getting the information from the aerial photographs accurately onto topographic maps to actually create the geologic maps as such.
Following the field work, tell me how the data was worked up and published.
The idea was, of course, each of these 5 sort of field-oriented topical studies that were part of the comprehensive geologic framework of Yellowstone, Each of these would be published separately, but brought together in a series of U.S. Geological Survey publications, professional papers. And so they got published at different times over a long interval of time. And mine was actually the last of these to be published because a great deal of further work after that initial intensive period of field study went into that professional paper. So although the field work was done, the bulk of it, probably 85 or 90% of the work was done from 1966 to 1971, the publication didn't come out until 2001. So there was really a period of 30 years of additional field work and additional studies and interruptions in the work with other things taking place, and all the while working on this professional paper. It got to be something of an albatross after a while, but that's the way these things often turn out.
Was there any pressure to publish your work?
I had a great deal of interest in the publication, and I distributed preliminary working copies of it over a period of years as the revisions of the manuscript took place to many colleagues, including not just USGS colleagues, but particularly our colleague Bob Smith at the University of Utah, who's a geophysicist. He and his students were doing a lot of work during this time of this later phase of my work, but they were very interested in having the publication from the overall study of the volcanic geology, and so they were among the people I shared early versions of it with, and ultimately have been able to give the final publications to.
How was it revealed that there were 3 calderas?
We weren't able to fully delineate the caldera structures until the mapping was really pretty well complete. As the work evolved, we got parts of the picture. I would say within the first 2 summers, we had a pretty good idea of the Yellowstone caldera, which is the youngest of the 3. And we realized that it had 2 resurgent domes. It's one of a class of calderas called resurgent calderas, which means that magma coming back into the near surface after the initial partial emptying of the magma chamber and collapse of the surface to form the caldera, came back into it and domed up what had been the caldera floor into a structural dome. And this class of calderas had been identified by another Bob Smith who worked for the USGS and his colleague Roy Bailey, and had been recognized in many places around the world in these large calderas. But this is the first time, I think, that we recognized one that actually had these 2 separate structural domes as part of a single caldera. So it was simply so large that the magma had generated what amounts to 2 ring fracture zones that partially coalesced. We recognized that probably in broad outline after about the second field summer, but we really didn't have the full picture of all the calderas until the geologic mapping was completed. And that's an important thing to realize, is that it's the real structure, the understanding these calderas, where they were, and in fact that there were these several calderas, was learned on the basis of in-the-field mapping, geologic mapping. There's sort of an apocryphal story that has gone around in many different forms that somehow NASA discovered these from space. And I think that stems from this idea that NASA was partially sponsoring this work, and funding part of it, a major part of it, as part of their ground truthing of remote sensing instruments. But they did not discover the calderas. The calderas were discovered on the ground by traditional field geologic mapping.
Just to be clear, what was the USGS role in this science?
The USGS role in all this was really central. I mean, we were the people doing the field work. We collaborated very closely with both the Park Service and NASA. NASA basically provided funding and did some of the remote sensing instrumentation, which we then, our observation, which we then utilized in some of our work. We looked at infrared images, radar images, some of the aerial photography they took. We worked on analyzing some of that data for NASA so that they could utilize, again, use the sort of ground truth concept in understanding the nature of the data they were getting in these instruments. So the USGS was really doing the hands-on work of what was in the field and relating the field work to the imagery. The Park Service's role was primarily in wanting a comprehensive study done for their own interpretive program so that they would have better, newer information that they could pass on to the public. And so they were very interested in getting this information, and they were very active in having us work with their staff, for example, in giving them background talks and sort of thing, and actually working with some of the naturalists in promoting how to present some of it. But really, I would say that it's the USGS that was the active partner in actually doing most of the work on site.
So were there seminal publications of USGS geologic findings for Yellowstone?
Okay, one of the first publications that I think caught some general attention was one that was published in 1975 in the journal Science. And it was an attempt to bring together what we had learned now on the basis of our initial period of fieldwork and understanding the general picture of the volcanic evolution of Yellowstone in the latest Cenozoic time, say in the last 2 million years roughly, and bringing that together with the geophysical data, which had also been acquired during the same period of time using some of the same sources of funding. So we had a new geologic map, we had a new gravity map, we had a new aeromagnetic map, a certain number of seismic studies had been done, that is passive studies, studying earthquake distribution, seismicity in the park. And so bringing this information together and interpreting it enabled us to interpret not only the surface geology, but how it was related to what we felt was the subsurface magmatic system. And so this was brought together, I think for the first time, in a paper published in 1975, in which we felt that we had, in a number of ways, at least partially imaged the magma chamber that underlies Yellowstone and is both the source of the major volcanic eruptions that have occurred there over this 2 million year period, and the major source of the geothermal heat, which of course is what Yellowstone is best known for, is its hydrothermal systems.
How was Gordy Eaton involved in this journal Science publication?
The person who actually brought this paper together, that is, gathered the various elements of the data, particularly the geophysical data, and worked with me then on the geologic interpretation of it, was Gordon Eaton. And at that time, Gordy was working in Reston for the USGS headquarters, and was, I think, a little frustrated by the fact that he wasn't able to do much field work. But when he started to see some of this geophysical data, particularly the gravity map that had just been compiled, he became really excited about it and recognized that the gravity map itself was showing a big subsurface system related to the Yellowstone caldera. And so he was the one who sort of then gathered together the other geophysical information and worked with me on the geologic interpretation. So Gordon Eaton was the primary author of that multi-author paper. All USGS people, however, who were contributing to it.
When did it become apparent that the caldera was inflating?
Yeah, probably one of the most interesting additional pieces of data that came along after this period of time we've been describing with the early field work, more or less the completion of the initial geologic studies and doing the geophysical interpretations that helped understand the subsurface part of it. Bob Smith at the University of Utah was interested in seeing if we could look for signs of contemporary deformation in the Yellowstone caldera. He had recognized some of these indications, particularly in changes in lake levels in different parts of Yellowstone Lake, which is a very large lake. And because it's so large, and of course water tending to always seek a level, he felt that there was indications that the lake basin itself was being tilted. And because of this, the lake level was rising at one end of the lake and falling at the other end of the lake. And he was interested in seeing whether we could actually measure this by some direct means. So one of the things I did, at that time I was in an administrative position in the survey. I was the coordinator of the USGS geothermal program. I managed to get funding together to get the USGS topographic division involved in a re-leveling. They had leveled the road network in the park. That is, surveyed it using level instruments which gave a series of elevations on all the roads in the park back in the 1920s, I think 24 and 25 if I remember correctly. And there had not been a re-leveling since that time. We felt that with as much deformation as there appeared to be based on these lake level changes, that there should be measurable changes in elevations in the park. So we finally got the funding together and got that survey done, and the data was provided to Bob Smith and his group at the University of Utah, and they in turn integrated all this material into a series of elevation changes, the map of elevation changes throughout the caldera, and demonstrated that in fact the caldera in the roughly 50-year period of time between these two surveys had come up about 2/3 of a meter, a couple of feet, and correspondingly less elsewhere, so that it was a dome-shaped uplift that had taken place during this 50 years. A rather spectacular amount of uplift, indicating that the magmatic system in some form was active. Either the magma was actually intruding the crust, or it was heating the hydrothermal system and causing it to expand and elevate the crust. Something was going on. Subsequent to that, there have been additional surveys which showed that in fact then after a period of continued uplift over the next decade or so, there then was a period of stability for about a year, and then there was subsidence. So we now know that the Yellowstone caldera is not simply going up, but it goes up and down in a sort of breathing motion apparently at times. Its overall deformation does seem to be an inflationary one, but it's not a steady sort of thing, and there are in fact periods of deflation.
How does the Yellowstone story fit in with things like the Columbia River flood basalts to the west?
Yellowstone, we now understand, is the contemporary expression of a system that has been active in the Earth's uppermost layers, in the upper mantle and lower crust, that has been active, magmatically active, over a period of at least about 17 million years. The earliest expression of this appears to have been related to the vast outpouring of basaltic magmas in the form of big basalt lava flows that covered the Columbia River Plateau. Most of them erupted from the eastern part of the plateau in the northern Rocky Mountains of eastern Idaho and western Idaho and eastern Washington, but flowed across the the Columbia River Plateau, essentially filled the plateau and spilled through the Columbia Gorge out to the coastal region along into the sea. So this vast outpouring of basalts over a very short period of time. Really, the biggest bulk of those came out during less than 1 million years, around 17 million years ago, roughly. That was the first expression of this, but then the later expressions have been more or less along a linear trend, which is now represented by the eastern Snake River Plain, beginning in southwestern Idaho about 14 or 15 million years ago, and continuing through southeastern Idaho right up to the Idaho border and then into Wyoming. And as I say, the current expression of this so-called hot spot is the Yellowstone Plateau magmatic system. But we can find evidence that similar systems of mainly rhyolitic magmas but associated basalts of earlier ages form a chain of calderas now buried by younger basaltic lavas along the eastern Snake River Plain. So the origin of this so-called hot spot is a subject of great contemporary interest and some dispute in the geologic literature.
What is the connection between the Grand Tetons and Yellowstone?
Yellowstone, although it's actually in the Rocky Mountains, is really much more related to the Basin and Range province than it is to what we typically think of as Rocky Mountain geology. Rocky Mountain geology, for the most part, goes back to what we call a Laramide and earlier, which is the latest Mesozoic, let's say roughly 65 million years ago to something back even 70 million years and earlier. So that geology is sort of a framework, but the Basin and Range geology, which mostly is expressed in Nevada and western Utah and surrounding parts of Oregon and Idaho, actually encroaches into the Central and Northern Rocky Mountains. And Yellowstone is right where that impingement of the basin range tectonics, ongoing active tectonics, extensional faulting and spreading of the Earth's crust, intersects with some of these pre-existing structures. And so the Tetons are an expression, the Tetons as we see them now are an expression of this basin and range topography, which in turn is an expression of basin and range faulting, with the Jackson Hole being the downdropped block and the Tetons themselves being the uplifted block. If this were in the middle of Nevada, you would think of it as nothing different than the Toyabe Range or some other range and valley system in the Central Great Basin.
How has evolving technology affected your work?
My own work has been primarily on the geology, both the field geology and then looking at some of the analytical work we do on samples collected in the field, both chemical and age determination, working with colleagues on those things. But most of the technological changes in what we've been able to do and been able to learn about the Yellowstone magmatic system have been more in the geophysics. So we now have much better seismology, for example. We have digital broadband seismic instrumentation, whereas we used to simply have analog, sometimes just one component, sometimes three component seismometers. Particularly the deformation studies, which we used to do primarily by leveling, are now done by GPS measurements in the field. And a number of other additional developments, including things like using satellite photography, comparing different satellite images and getting interferograms, as they're called, which show the difference and changes in surface features, which again reflect some of this uplift and subsidence that we talked about in the Yellowstone caldera.
How did you collaborate with your USGS colleagues during field work?
Well, certainly one of the joys of that period of time, particularly in the mid to late 1960s, when we were working as a group of teams, really, in the field, we frequently got together. And even though we were working on different topical elements, there obviously are very strong interrelationships among them. And so we were working with the people and getting together, both in a kind of in-the-field socialization kind of thing, as well as scientifically interacting with these other teams. In particular, with the group of people studying the geothermal systems, the hydrothermal activity. Don White, Bob Fournier, Patrick Muffler, and Al Truesdell were the four people doing physical and geochemical studies of the hydrothermal systems during this period of time. And because that's so intimately related to the young volcanism that was my primary field of study, we spent a lot of time together and looking at each other's work and seeing how what each of us was learning separately helped the others to understand the framework of their own work. So it was a particularly good time, both scientifically and just in terms of good comradeship.
Did you learn things from the drilling that clarified the caldera story?
One example of the kind of thing that we learned from the drilling studies, which of course were done to study the hydrothermal system, but they made continuous core drillings of the entire holes that they went into, which were sometimes just 100 feet or a few tens of feet, and sometimes many hundreds of feet. The deepest one I think was 1,300 feet. So these were a great opportunity for us to see some of the subsurface geology that was otherwise inaccessible to us. So not just the geophysical studies that were done too, but some of the shallow subsurface we were able to observe directly. The most interesting aspect of this was a particular drill hole in the lower geyser basin, or the Midway geyser basin as it's called, in the western part of Yellowstone, where we had interpreted that there was a resurgent dome in the western part of the caldera, but could only see the young rocks that had covered the original caldera floor being uplifted. We were able to interpret the fact that there were actually two episodes of uplift, one very close to the time of subsidence. Caldera subsidence occurred, and very shortly afterwards there was inflation to form the resurgent dome. on the basis of a drill cord that was put down there which showed that there was, in fact, Lava Creek tuff, the 600,000-year-old tuff, present within 10 meters of the surface, within about 30 feet or so of the surface, which was not to be seen at the surface anywhere. We had expected it would be there, but to actually have it and to get samples of it and be able to know which unit it was and so forth was a particularly useful thing to us in interpreting the structure of the caldera.
Did you encounter any wild animals during field work?
We, meaning Dick Blank and I, who did most of the mapping of the young volcanics, were very lucky in not having any serious encounters with wild animals. We did encounter them and were able to maneuver in such ways that they were never a direct threat to us. But there were a few times when it became a little scarier than you would really like. One episode I remember in particular with a field assistant being out in a backcountry area and coming up a trail on our way home after spending a long day in the field and being very tired, and on our way down the trail on our way home. And here was a grizzly bear. We came around a corner, and there was a grizzly bear sitting right on the trail as we were headed there. And as we came around the corner, this grizzly bear stood up and looked at us, and that was not a particularly comforting sight. Fortunately, the bear decided that we either weren't interesting or he didn't want to mess with us, or we certainly didn't want to mess with him. So the bear turned around and went away, and after some misgivings, we finally did decide to walk on down that trail. So those near encounters are entertaining, if you will, in retrospect, but we never felt we were in direct danger.
Oh, you're lucky.
Yeah, right. There were others. There were other people who did have encounters, and one of the things that, because of what we were doing, Dick Blank and I did not use helicopters. We did everything we did on foot. However, some of the other people working in the park did use helicopters, and there was one instance where the glacial geology crew actually were working with a helicopter. The pilot decided to have his lunch in the helicopter one day, and so then when everybody was off in the field, a bear got into the helicopter and totally tore it up from the inside, and in fact destroyed the helicopter basically, so it had to be flown out with assistance later.
Did your family spend summers in Yellowstone as well?
During that first 5 or 6 summers of intensive field work, my family came out with me in the field every summer. So we would usually drive from Denver, where I was living at that time, up to Yellowstone, which was for us typically a day and a half's drive. You could do it in a day, but we usually chose to extend it a little bit. So in a day and a half, we would get up there. The interesting part of this was we had 2 little boys. We had twin boys who the first summer we went up there in June were about 9 months old. So they were still crawling. We were to have a brand new government trailer as our permanent quarters, but it had not yet arrived. So we were more or less stuck in what they called camper cabins in the Old Faithful area. These were really kind of dingy, old, concrete floored log cabins with heated only by a wood stove. And the floors were so dirty, my wife wouldn't let the boys crawl around on it. So what she did was build a little playpen with suitcases around the double bed. And the boys spent about the first week playing on this double bed. And my wife and it turned out it rained a lot during that particular week too. So indoors was pretty much the order of the day every day for several days in a row. By the end of that week, my wife was somewhat near wit's end when our brand new house trailer finally arrived. So we all of a sudden moved into this trailer, which probably if we had started directly in that trailer would have seemed very cramped and small. But at that point, it was clean and new and big, and it just looked wonderful to her. So that was actually almost a slight benefit of having had to spend that rather miserable first week in the camper cabin.
How old were your boys?
The boys were 9 months old when we first went to Yellowstone. They had their first birthday in the park before we came home in September of that year.
What were your favorite sort of locations?
Well, I think a couple of my favorite locations in terms of the geology. The park as a whole is such a wonderful place that I don't have any particular favorites just in terms of what areas I like. But in terms of geology, there's one particular place that really stands out is Mount Everett, which is an area just east of Mammoth Hot Springs. And this is the locality I referred to earlier where Joe Boyd had thought there was a vent for one of the welded tuffs, but where Dick Blank and I actually went on our first day there and found that in fact what it is a place where the base of the Huckleberry Ridge tuff, the 2-million-year-old tuff, is well exposed, sitting on gravels in a paleo valley. But then this whole thing had been cut through by a younger canyon, a canyon of Lava Creek, and the younger Lava Creek tuff, the 600,000-year tuff, had then come into the eroded surface of the Huckleberry Ridge. So what you can see there is the gravel at the base of the Huckleberry Ridge on erosional surface, the Huckleberry Ridge itself, well exposed with its vitrific base, its glassy base, and then the erosion cut into it, and the Paleo Valley, with a soil developed on it, and this younger ash flow tuff that comes into it, actually incorporating talus off of the older flow, and having come in and chilled against it, so you again get a glassy margin to the younger flow where it contacted the older pre-existing ground surface. It's just a great place to see these kinds of relationships, and I've taken many geologists there over the years. Unfortunately, it's a couple hours walk to get in.
Okay.
That's one of them. The other one is Huckleberry Mountain, which is Huckleberry Ridge and Huckleberry Mountain are parts of the same topographic feature, which is just outside the south entrance, near where the Snake River comes out of the park on the south side. And again, it's a fairly steep hike up to it, but it's a spectacular exposure of the Huckleberry Ridge tuff, the 2-million-year-old tuff, which shows all three members, which were in place at slightly different times, but form a single cooling unit in that area. And you see the contacts between them perfectly well exposed in what amounts to the head wall of a landslide that has sort of made a clean exposure of relationships that are ordinarily rather obscure and hard to see in the trees.
Can you please spell your name for me and explain your area of expertise?
Okay, my name is Patrick Muffler, and the last name is Muffler, just like what's under a car. It's an old German name. We've traced it back to about 1730, and I'm not going to tell you what it means. I've worked for the Geological Survey since I was a freshman in college in 1955, and started full-time here in Menlo Park in January of 1962, where I was affiliated with the Alaskan Geology Branch and was working in southeast Alaska with 3 other geologists. I had a congenital hip problem, and it got worse in Alaska, so I got out of that kind of Boy Scout work and was fortunate enough to stumble into hot spring work with my mentor, Donald E. White, whom you'll be hearing a lot about over the next day. We got started working on the Salton Sea geothermal system in Southern California, and then kind of out of the blue, NASA decided that they wanted to use Yellowstone as a ground truth site for a lot of their space exploration stuff. And they came to the Geological Survey and provided the Geological Survey with then what was a big hunk of money, and allowed a whole set of investigations to develop up there. Everything from regional geologic mapping down to very detailed studies of the hot spring areas. And Don got immediately involved in that. Bob Fournier had already worked in Yellowstone, consulting to the Park Service on Beryl Spring, and in doing silica solubility work with Dr. Morey in Washington. And Bob and Don were kind of the nucleus and the leaders of our group in Yellowstone. And then Alfred Truesdell and I were the junior people up there trying to find out what we could do that hadn't already been done by these geothermal gods. So we had our first endeavor up there was mainly the first year in 1965, when we basically went up there, did some geologic mapping in the hot spring areas, looked around, got a feel for things, and of course it was based, what we did in '66, which was when the drilling campaign started, it was based on the wireline drilling that Don had done at Steamboat Springs in Nevada, which had been a very successful endeavor looking at the physical properties in the upper part of hot spring systems. Well, our Yellowstone work was predicated upon that example. So we developed a 2-year diamond drilling program up there, which is really the cornerstone of the work that we did in Yellowstone. The cornerstone in the sense that it not only provided us with accurate temperature and pressure measurements in the upper part of the hot spring systems, but also provided us with drill core, looking at what the water had actually done to the rocks, and it provided us with fluid samples at controlled temperatures and pressures, and a whole raft of other collateral data that made the endeavor, I think, truly unique and a real tribute to Don White's vision in leading it and organizing it.
Was there any resistance to scientific drilling in Yellowstone?
I'm sure there must have been some. We had great support from the Park Service staff, particularly John Good, the chief naturalist. I don't believe we ever had a written agreement with Yellowstone. I think it was just word of mouth. We had good support all around. There were all around. There were certain individuals, certain district rangers who in the park who clearly were had some reluctance, and most of it had to do with surface scars. And this was particularly the case at the drill hole we drilled at Sulphur Cauldron, which it was a really rainy spring. We got the drill rig stuck in the mud. We got the flatbed truck stuck in the mud over at the next drill hole. We had to winch him out, and it left a heck of a mess. And that upset at least one ranger. But in terms of significant controversy, I don't recall any whatsoever. Now, obviously, right now, if we were to go in and do that sort of drilling project in Yellowstone, writing the environmental impact statement would be a century-long process if it ever happened. Mm-hmm. I think we were just under everybody's radar screen at that time.
Why was NASA interested in Yellowstone?
I don't remember the details of their analysis, but fundamentally it was just they were using Yellowstone as an example of what they might find on some other planet at that time. And so they said, okay, we're going to look at it from space, see what we can see from space, and then look at it on the ground and compare the two and see how these two images, if you will, merge.
What was the principal focus of your research?
I was focused entirely on the hydrothermal systems, although we did interact extensively with Bob Christensen in terms of the geologic mapping, particularly where it got into the hot spring areas. We actually found the Lava Creek tuff first in one of the drill holes in Rabbit Creek. We didn't even know it existed in that part of the world. And that led to a very interesting interaction between me and Don White. Don came up and I said that, you know, we found this ash flow tuff in there and that I'd taken it down and showed it to Bob Christensen, and he'd agreed that it was ash flow tuff, and Don said it couldn't possibly be. And this darn near led to blows. That I mean, he was just adamant that it couldn't possibly be ash flow tuff, and it did indeed turn out to be, and everything worked out okay. But it was it wasn't all sweetness and light.
What was the geologic understanding of Yellowstone when you began working there?
It was only a few years before that Joe Boyd had recognized that indeed it was a caldera there that basically was filled with rhyolites. Nobody else had ever recognized this. And of course then Bob Christensen went in there and mapped it in detail and showed that not only there was just the one caldera, there are actually three major calderas separated by about 600,000 years between each one. So our geologic knowledge of it was really predicated on the work of very early surveys that had been done. The Hayden survey, a lot of work that Allen and Day did on hot spring work. But the first really modern geologic studies were Joe Boyd's and then Bob Christensen and his colleagues. And then the peripheral studies on the Paleozoic rocks and Mesozoic rocks by people like Harry Smeads and Ed Ruppel and a batch of others. And then at the same time, we had a group looking very carefully at the glacial history of that, led by Jerry Richmond with Ken Pierce and Harry Waldrop on it. So it was quite a diverse group of USGS scientists who were involved. I haven't mentioned all of them by any means, and we were fortunate in being very well supported by the management of the Geological Survey at that time. This mega project got exceptionally good support all the way up the line. A real critical person was a branch chief by the name of Art Campbell in Denver, whom we didn't work for, but was clearly a instrumental person in making the work of people like Christensen and Ruppel and Smeads possible.
Describe working with your colleagues on Yellowstone topics.
Well, we had a lot of visitors up there. We had people coming through all the time. And in fact, as I go back through my field notes, I'm amazed at some of the people that I actually showed around up there that I had completely and totally forgotten. We had a lot of interaction, not only among the four of us, but we'd get down and stop in and see Bob Christensen every time we could. He's always been kind of a geological god to me, so it was always fun to go down and see him. And there was not a formal network, but you just made every opportunity you could to talk to people. You didn't use the phone that much. A lot of letters. Back then, it's amazing how communication and interaction was indeed by typewritten letter.
Tell the story of the Lava Creek Tough and your mentor, Don White.
Well, first of all, the context of this was a disagreement with Don, but you do have disagreements with your close colleagues, and I want to be sure that I'm absolutely explicit that Don White was my mentor. He got me into geothermal energy, he got me started on the Salton Sea area, which was the first major thing I did in my career. He got me involved in Yellowstone. He supported me in all of the subsequent work I did in geothermal energy, and without Don White, I would be Lord knows where at the moment. But this particular one that I was up there on one of the drill holes, and we found this rock which I thought was a ash flow tuff, an ignimbrite, if you will. So I, knowing Christensen was down at Flag Ranch near the Tetons, I drove down there with it and I showed it to Chris. And I said, Chris, I think this is an ash flow tuff. And Chris said, yes, it is. So we were quite excited about this because of its structural position. This was well within the major caldera there. And you think of a caldera as a subsidence structure, but to see the stuff that had subsided somehow getting pushed up near the surface was statistically impossible, particularly since it never is exposed at the surface there. In other words, the only exposure of this particular rock that we yet ever found was in the drill hole. And so we actually went in with Bob Christensen, and we got a bunch with some rangers to go with us and some workers from Old Faithful Inn to go into this area and blitz it in terms of looking for ash flow tuff. The reason we did it with a great huge group of people is this country was just rife with grizzly bears. We were drilling at a dump, and at that time the dumps were just open things sitting in the park, and the grizzly bears came in every night, and they slurped up all of the garbage that came. And of course you walked around the area and it was just full of droppings of blue plastic bags and glass and what have you. You could understand why the grizzly bears were very unhappy people. And so we went in there with bells and whistles and everybody screaming and yelling to basically try and be safe while we were in there, because no way was either I or Bob Christensen going to go map in there individually. I mean, we would have been dead meat. And so that was the result of it. So we were left with this occurrence in the drill hole, which is an improbable situation. But once we looked at the whole drill hole carefully, looked at the thin sections, did the petrography on it, any question. It just was, you know, Don came up and he didn't believe it, and he got very mad, and it blew over. That was just life.
Why did NASA care about your hydrothermal work?
Well, Jake's question was your question, excuse me, was did NASA pay for the drilling? And to my knowledge, they did pay for the drilling. They were interested in what was the nature of the hydrothermal systems, to understand them such that if they saw certain things at the surface on another planet, they would have some idea as to what they meant other than just at the very top of the surface. And the other question was, what did the survey kick into this? Salaries? I would assume the survey just paid our salaries, but I don't know. I was a very junior geologist at that time, and I didn't worry about any of that bureaucratic stuff.
Was it exciting to work in Yellowstone?
Oh, it was spectacularly exciting. First of all, to visit it not just as a tourist, which I had done before, but to actually have some raison d'etre for doing things, looking at hot springs, walking around with people like Bob and Don and learning what they did, what they had done up there, what their knowledge of hot springs was. And of course, Yellowstone is the premier hot spring area of the world. I mean, any feature that you want to see in a hot spring, you're going to see at Yellowstone, and a lot more that never occur anywhere else. So it was, you were just thrown into a geologist heaven up there. There were just so many things to do and look at, and our interests went in so many different directions among the four of us. We were not clones up there by any stretch of the imagination. That, of course, Bob and Alfred were very much involved in the water chemistry. I got involved in the nature of the rock alteration. I got involved in the geophysics up there, working with Adel Zodi in Denver. Dick Blank was working up there, and we were using something called AFMAG, which I couldn't tell you what it is anymore, but we were trying to look at the subsurface aspects of the hot spring areas with detailed magnetic surveys, if you will. It was a very exciting, stimulating time, and we were going in 65 different directions.
How did the theory of plate tectonics developing in the 60s affect your work at that time?
At that time, it impacted it very, very little, because this was in the middle of the continent, if you will. People hadn't really yet focused on, for example, the track up the eastern Snake River Plain to Yellowstone. They were still busy looking at defining what subduction zones and spreading ridges were and the major tectonic features, and we were just in the middle of a plate, and plate tectonics really didn't enter much into our thinking. Now, this may have a very different answer to that story. He may have been thinking about, well, you know, why do you have this major volcanic anomaly sitting in the middle of the plate here? And that's of course, consumed people for generations since. But as far as I'm concerned, I was focused on the hot spring phenomenon in the upper few hundred feet of the few hundred feet below the surface.
Have you examined the question of hydrothermal explosions in Yellowstone?
Well, I was aware of hydrothermal explosions because Don White studied a major hydrothermal explosion at Lake City in northeastern California, Surprise Valley. I believe it was in 1955. And basically this innocuous hot spring area in the middle of the night went up in the air and scattered itself all over the landscape. And Don got up there a little while later and wrote a very interesting paper in the Bulletin of the Geological Society of America on that. But, and that was kind of in the back of his mind and my mind when we went up there. But then we started finding these crater-like features in the hot spring areas, particularly something called Pocket Basin, which is in Lower Geyser Basin, which is something like 3/4 of a mile in diameter or half a mile by 3/4, I forget the details. And it turned out, to make a long story short, that this turned out to be the classic hydrothermal explosion feature. Hydrothermal explosion feature meaning that the upper part of a hot spring system that is everywhere at the boiling point becomes unstable for a variety of different reasons and basically explodes. No magma's involved. It's not like it's not a explosion like the phreatomagmatic explosions they get in Hawaii. This is just an inevitable happening at in the upper part of a hydrothermal system where the temperatures along the boiling point curve are increasing very rapidly with depth. And of course, that creates a very unstable situation. It turns out that we found a number of these things that seem to have happened at about the time of deglaciation up there. So we reasoned in a paper that Don and I and Alfred wrote, we reasoned that basically you had a very rapid decrease in pressure on the hydrothermal system owing to the draining of a lake impounded by glaciers, by a Yokalalp, if you will. And the fact that the lake went from such and such a level to such and such a level down here with a hot spring underneath it, the hot spring at that time then became way above the boiling point curve and simply exploded. And this seems to have been a pervasive phenomenon, not only in the geyser basins, but also over at Lake, been worked on extensively by other scientists subsequent to our work. Well, we got involved in that, and that was probably the most interesting and exciting paper I've ever written. I mean, it was just, you couldn't wait to come to work on that paper. You were so excited about the nature of the stuff you found, and it was pretty new stuff too. And you could document a lot of it. I mean, you could show that the fragments in the hydrothermal explosion breccia were hydrothermally altered rock. They weren't, you know, it all made sense, and it was great fun. Then Alfred did a lot of really neat analytical work on it that built into it. So that was the thing. And of course, that's led to an analysis currently going on of, okay, now what is the nature of the hazards at Yellowstone? And I think most of us would agree that one of the more likely happenings is are hydrothermal explosions for various purposes. We've had them at Black Sand Basin, and we've had them over at Lake in that area, and they're certainly a lot more likely than the super volcano sort of thing that gets all the media attention.
Were you worried about pressure releases during drilling?
You bet. We had the experience of a guy by the name of Clarence Fenner from the Carnegie Institution that had drilled several holes in the geyser basins in 1929. And one in Yellowstone in particular, they really had problems with. And there's some wonderful pictures of, here's this old wood drilling platform with just steam coming out all around it. And there's a wonderful quote from Clarence Fenner there that he was describing a particular series of events where steam started coming out, and Fenner's comment was, "And the driller became apprehensive." Well, definitely got our attention, and we went in there with our eyes open that there was a real potential. We were drilling into systems which had the potential of exploding both through the drilling pipe itself, but also, if we didn't case them properly and didn't drill the well properly, around the drill hole. That was in the back of our minds. Fortunately, we didn't have to write an environmental impact statement, but it's not like we were neglecting it. And indeed, we learned as we earned on this one, that we had a wonderful drilling crew from Sprague and Henwood, particularly a guy by the name of Max Kingsley and his helper, Lem Hames. And these guys just became absolute pros at working at drilling in these high temperature situations. We developed equipment on the fly to be able to, for example, when you got at very high temperatures and pressures, the water inside these were water-cooled drill rods. The water inside was over the boiling temperature. So if you had to add another rod to the drill string, you basically had to erupt the water out of the drill string, add the rod, but you didn't want to have the water keep coming up through the drill bit, so we developed a one-way valve that went in down there. And that, I would say, was fabricated on the fly. We said, we need this, and either Sprague and Henwood developed it, or Bob developed it back here. And there was all sorts of these things, and it became very routine, particularly drilling at the last Norris hole, where you expected the drill rods to produce this spectacular eruption every time you pulled core, every time you added a section of rod, or every time you did anything. Now, the really dicey one was at the second hole we drilled, where we found that the nipple, the bit of pipe that attached the valve to the casing, had developed a crack in it. I remember Don White down on his hands and knees looking at that and finding that crack. Well, how do you fix that? Basically, what they designed was a wood plug, which they put on the drill string, put it down, crammed it into the casing down there, unscrewed it, pulled out the drill string, removed the valve, removed the offending cracked nipple, put a new nipple back on, put the valve back on, and then pulled the wood plug and shut the valve. I think I've got that right. But that was, regardless of the details of that, it was a exciting business. And when we were drilling up there, it wasn't that we just had the two drillers sitting up on the rig. We were up there horsing around drill pipe. I mean, it was other duties as assigned commensurate with abilities. And if I'm not mistaken, Bob cracked a rib up on there hauling around drill pipe at one time. And of course, Don White was up there. He had a bad hip. I was up there, I had a bad hip, and Alfred was up there with a bad ankle. So it was really but it was a very effective team collaboration with the drillers. There's another guy, Buddy Tawney, that was involved also. That was pretty darn exciting and very rewarding for everybody concerned, and ultimately very, very successful.
Okay.
Do you remember the first hole you drilled?
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about that.
Oh, you bet. It was the Y1 out at a Whistler Geyser in Black Sand Basin. And I remember drilling it, and I remember it was the first one where we were in high temperatures, and we learned a lot, and it was successful. And we set up a water stage recorder on Whistle Geyser, which is right next to it. We were able to demonstrate the effect of the drilling on the geyser, and it was a good scientific project. I remember it in great part because it was very snowy. This was in April, of 1967, and I have a wonderful picture of the phone booth at Old Faithful with the snow level about 5 feet above the top of the phone booth. And I remember calling my wife from there and she telling me that she had bought a house.
Why drill in April?
Well, because the places that were very exposed to tourists, you wanted to drill in the very early spring or the late fall, to the extent weather would allow you. The last thing you wanted to do was to be drilling at Whistle Geyser or Black Sand Basin in the middle of summer. It just would not have worked. And even then, you still had a lot of interaction with tourists where we were drilling in the parking lot at Norris Geyser Basin, and virtually one of us at all times was talking to somebody who had stopped and wanted to know what we were doing. It was an inevitable distraction of resources.
Did you look for magmatic evidence in the drill materials?
No, not the drilled materials, but in the materials that were expelled from these craters. The craters were obvious. The question was, were they related to a magmatic event, or were they strictly the explosion of the upper part of a hydrothermal system? And the default explanation would be magma. So we looked very, very careful, very, very carefully for any evidence of this and found none. And most people were not aware of the fact that boiling at the surface at Yellowstone was, say, about 91 degrees Celsius. But the boiling temperature increases very, very quickly with depth along the boiling point curve. And that provides a mechanism for explosion, which most people, other than people like Bob Fournier, were simply not aware of. In fact, I probably got that idea from Bob and Don. They were fully aware of the importance of the boiling point curve in the upper part of hydrothermal systems, and it was just a step from that to visualize that as a mechanism for this explosion. And in fact, if you went back, you probably find it's inherent in half a dozen papers Don White wrote. They're very, very new things. There's one little vignette about new things that Alfred and I were so excited about, the fact that we found that these big flats in Lower Geyser Basin were actually not alluvium, as some of our colleagues had mapped 10 or 15 years before, but were actually nothing but diatoms. There were 10, 15, 18 feet of diatom mud. And we thought this was a wonderful discovery. Made sense, all the high silica water coming out, the diatoms loved to live there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we had roughed out a paper we were going to write, and then I had the brains to go back and look at the literature and found out that Harvey Walter Weed had actually published that in 1868 or 1886 or something like that. There's very little that's new under the sun.
So the diatoms were in the hydrothermal system, or were they in a
No.
lake-type setting?
The waters coming out of the hydrothermal systems, when they went over the silica terraces, they evaporated, if you will, or deposited the hard silica that makes up the geyser cones in the silica terraces. But then as the water cools, it drifts down into these broad flats. They're called fountain flats in this particular case. And the diatoms love high silica water. The water's nice and cold by the time it gets there. It's an absolutely ideal environment for diatoms to flourish. And they do.
Were there any epiphanies in studying Yellowstone?
Well, the light bulb obviously went off with all of us with respect to the hydrothermal explosion features. I remember a rather unimportant time when the light bulb went off for me, that we were talking about, what were going to be the dangers when we moved on to drilling at Norris, because we were all concerned about drilling at Norris because that's where Fenner had all the problems. So I was staying in a cabin at Old Faithful, and I just reading Fenner's stuff in great detail, and I finally tumbled to some of the temperatures and pressures that he'd recorded. And I went charging over to Don's cabin and said, Don, do you realize what Fenner's data shows here? He says, yes. Like, you know, okay, you finally figured it out, kid. So there was lots of epiphanies of, if you will, greater or lesser. One of the real epiphanies that developed through the whole thing that Bob will talk about is how he and Alfred were able to develop these number of techniques to look at the chemical composition of waters and predict what the reservoir temperature was at depth. Overall, that was a not so much an epiphany as a development of knowledge that had tremendous impact in the whole geothermal industry.
Describe some of the hydrothermal work.
We were drilling in the very shallow areas of geothermal systems. We were not drilling at commercial geothermal depths, say 10,000 feet, but we were drilling at and seeing phenomenon that could be extrapolated to whatever depth you wanted. I mean, I guess what I would say is what really the product here was this professional paper that documented the temperature, pressure, depth relationships for these 13 drill holes in at least three different hydrothermal environments. You had the classic water systems of Upper Geyser Basin, you had the vapor-dominated system at Sulphur Cauldron, and then you had the calcium carbonate system at Mammoth. And they all gave very different results, but the thing that I would say illustrates the impact is we never got any static whatsoever on this professional paper. It was simply accepted as this is what it looks like in the upper part of high temperature hydrothermal systems, end of discussion. Now, with the exception of Don White's work at Steamboat Springs in Nevada, very few other areas in the world have had this sort of investigation at shallow depths. Most of the time, of course, in commercial drilling, you're trying to get through this shallow stuff just as fast as possible. You want to get down to 1,000 feet in case, thank you, and then drill on to where you're going to get your production depth. So this was and is, I believe, a unique data set that is comprehensively documented, and in particularly documented not only in terms of the physical parameters, particularly temperature and pressure, which are measured very systematically, but in terms of also studying the core that came out of the wells. That was studied extensively by me, by Terry Keith, by Keith Barger, and a variety of other people that came in and worked on specific aspects of it. And there was a other spin-off that came off of this, but the real core of our results is in that drilling professional paper, I think.
Summarize the range of work that took place.
Overall, this was a very comprehensive effort of the USGS with the financial support from NASA to develop a comprehensive understanding of Yellowstone National Park and vicinity. And it encompassed not only the study of the active processes, which we were involved in primarily, but worked back through the glacial history, through the volcanic history, through the early volcanic history of the Absaroka volcanoes, and then into the Paleozoic and Mesozoic stratigraphy and structure. It was an effort to look at this elephant from a variety of different sides and see what it really looked like. And that was the context that came to us from NASA. They obviously, although I never met any of the program managers there, they obviously looked at this from a very broad scientific perspective. They didn't have any preconceived answer that they wanted here. They were interested that if they had the opportunity to look at a Yellowstone on another planet, how would they interpret what they saw? And they were smart enough to know that they needed to do more than just look at the hot springs, that they needed to look at the whole Yellowstone phenomenon, if you will. Now, of course, this just spawned a tremendous amount of subsequent effort, much of which turned out to be geophysical. The geophysical work took off when we developed our geothermal research program in 1973, and we put a lot of money into Yellowstone as essentially a test bed. I mean, you try things where you know there is hot water before you try it in some area where you're just looking for it. And we tried a lot of geophysical techniques up there, some of which were successful, some of which were an absolute bust. And then pretty much at the same time, Bob Smith at the University of Utah, a long-time interest in Yellowstone, got involved in that in terms of the seismology, in terms of the geodetic studies. We started finding out that the Yellowstone caldera is indeed a living and breathing thing that expands and collapses. Our colleague Dan Jurishin was very heavily involved in there, and there's a lot of continuing work. And then the whole question, when we go back to plate tectonics, is the fact that Yellowstone is at the head of this path of calderas that has come up the eastern Snake River Plain over the last 15 million years, with the head of it, if you will, being at Yellowstone right now. In fact, being in the eastern part of Yellowstone under the Sour Creek Dome. And Bob Smith has done a lot of work trying to look at the geophysical aspects of that part of Yellowstone, east of where I did any work at all, although Bob has been in there, trying to look for evidence of magma in there, that we may be having another eruption. I mean, it would be reasonable to say that if this melting anomaly has been marching up the eastern Snake River Plain for 15 million years, that we're not fortuitously here when it's stopping. In other words, the chances are it's going to keep migrating to the northeast, and the question is when. Now, this is not a scare tactic, as we all know that we've had 3 major caldera eruptions in Yellowstone separated by 600,000 years. So we're not saying, okay, next week there's going to be a caldera eruption. But I would be amazed over the next million years if something pretty big didn't happen up there. But that's over the next million years.
How did this work draw attention to the hotspot path leading up to Yellowstone?
This is one of the aspects that has evolved from the initial studies up there, that after the studies that Bob Christensen did at Yellowstone, people started realizing that yes, indeed, the Yellowstone was the youngest of a series of calderas that had migrated up the eastern Snake River Plain over the past 15 million years. And that the 3 youngest ones are actually in the general Yellowstone area. Well, it would be a little fortuitous if we were living at the exact time when this particular process decided to end. So given the fact that the last 3 eruptions of these calderas were separated by about 730,000 years, it would amaze me if sometime within, say, the next million, certainly 2 million years, we didn't have another eruption of that sort of magnitude. But 1 million years is a long time. I don't think I'm going to make it.
How did you and your colleagues communicate your findings?
Okay, you were asking what kind of documentation that we had. Well, of course, I do have my field notebooks. I maintained them religiously, as you saw up there. For the drilling, we kept drilling logbooks, and where we kept very close records of everything we did with the drill hole in terms of temperatures, pressures, when we pulled core, what the percentage of core recovery was, so on and so forth. And those were essential in terms of both writing the professional paper on the physical results, but also in terms of the studies we did on the core themselves. In terms of the bureaucracy of this, if you will, or the management, much of that was probably contained in typewritten letters that went back and forth, not between us particularly, but would be between, say, Don and the management back in Reston. And I think most of those have probably been lost in the dusty archives of somewhere or other. We do have, I still have a lot of the original geologic maps we did of the geyser basins. I have a magnificent orthophotograph of Pocket Basin that I've never managed to finish. You know, I could spend not only the next 10 years, but probably the next century finishing up stuff from everything that's lying around in this office.
Describe Bob's Yellowstone paper that was so eagerly anticipated.
Well, it was where Bob was trying to tie everything together in terms of the young volcanic geology of Yellowstone National Park and vicinity. It was intended to be if you will, a classic professional paper which dotted every I and crossed every T. Now, as it did take a long time to get out for a variety of reasons which really are not important. It is out, and it is an absolutely classic reference document for anyone that's working in Yellowstone.
Describe some of the hazards working in the park.
Well, you were asking things that memories that come up. One that comes up to me is the fact we had grizzly bears all around us when we were drilling at Y5 in Biscuit Basin. And you'd come out in the morning and you'd have to repair your water lines because the grizzlies had chewed them. And you'd be standing on the drill rig and you'd see grizzly bears wandering around 100 feet, 150 feet away from the drill rig. I mean, this was a dump we were drilling in, and the grizzly bears basically were attracted to the dump. You got other interesting things. I was walking through the Lodge Pine Woods in Lower Geyser Basin, looking down at the ground, trying to follow whether it was a came or a gravel bench or till, and looked up, and 10 feet in front of me was a big bull bison. And I looked there and I said, "Good evening," and I backed up and walked away. You know, if I'd have walked 10 feet further, I would have bumped noses with him, and that could be reasonably dangerous. The only time we were really ever chased by any animals was in elk birthing season. And for a few days there, the female elk got very, very aggressive about protecting the newborn. And Alfred and I, Mel Beeson and I, had some real problems with that one day. We just happened to stumble into things when there was some problems, and had to go way around to get away from these guys. Oh, what else? I'm sure Bob and Chris will come up with other things, but you've got to remember that, you know, I'm working on memories now that are 43 years ago, and a lot of water has gone under the bridge, and it's kind of hard to remember what some of the details were other than the generalities. This clearly was an extremely exciting time for all of us involved up there. We were really very privileged to have this opportunity.